way back in 1836, when America was still an open country full of bears and cougars and marauding Indians, when land was there for the taking, if you could defend it long enough to grow crops on it and raise animals and have a family to help you with the chores. A battle took place down in the deep Southwest, in a territory that people used to call the Texas. On one side, there were thousands of Mexican regular soldiers, marching with rifles and cannons under the command of the famous mustachioed general, Santa Anna. On the other, there were less than 200 Americans, looked after by Jim Bowie, the Arkansas scout. The Americans were all volunteers from every part of the frontier land. Woodsmen, scouts, hunters, trappers, riverboat sailors, even a dance hall gambler, and a boy who made his living getting honey from bees. They were there for just one thing, to hold the Mexicans back long enough so the new American army under Sam Houston could get up enough steam to drive them back into the Rio Grande. Well, they held out for 12 days at an old mission called the Alamo. But the odds were better than 10 to 1, and every last American paid with his life. One of the last to die was the most adventurous Indian scout, bear hunter, congressman, and pioneer hero the country had ever seen. His name was Colonel Davy Crockett, and this is his story.
I just seen a whole covey of checkered partridges settle in.
Whereabouts, Davy?
On the sun side of West Hill, yonder. Must be 10, 11 birds, looks like.
Take my gun down then and have a try. But you know the setup. Only enough powder and ball for one shot.
Yeah?
They cost money and ain't easy to get. You miss and you don't get supper. Bring back a partridge and your mom will cook 'em up pretty.
Hey, you know what I'll do? I just wait for them partridges to get in a line, and then I'll knock them all down with one shot and make a war bonnet out of the feathers.
Just one bird'll do, Davy. And take him in the head. Don't want none of that sweet meat spoiled.
Young Davy wasn't even 9 years old when he saw those birds settle in on the hillside. But he'd already had years in the woods behind him. His father and grandfather, who'd come over from Ireland, had both fought the British in the Revolutionary War before moving down into the state of Franklin. Later on, in 1796, this territory was to be called Tennessee, and it was there that Davy learned what he needed to know about hunting and trapping in order to eat and stay warm. He walked into the woods with his dad's big gun on his shoulder, a gun a foot taller than he was, and kept his eye on the place where partridges had flown down.
Boy, one of these days I'll be allowed to take out as much ammunition and powder as I can tote. And then I'll bring home a whole pack of game. Turkeys and rabbits and quail and deer and maybe even a bear. Bear's the thing. Boy, ain't a man till you got yourself a big old bear. Enough meat for half the winter, and the hide makes a good rug for sitting. No use thinking about that, though, with just one shot to my name. Better off worrying about how to smile a raccoon out of a tree to make me a cap. Hold on. What's that moving around in that blueberry patch? Wowee! It's a bear cub. And a fat one, too. Hey, come back here!
No sooner had Davy jerked back anxiously on the trigger than the cub's huge mother came scrambling up to see what the trouble was. Now, Davy had missed the cub by a good foot. He was in so much of a hurry. But that didn't soothe the big bear any. She roared again and took off after him. She would have caught him, too, if he hadn't turned and run down the hill, since that's the only way a person can beat a running bear. When Davy returned to the cabin, all he got for his trouble was a scolding for being so foolish as to shoot at a cub. And because he'd missed, he went to bed without supper.
I was just a breeder cub myself then, Quaker John, with a whole passel to learn. But I sure enough killed me an even dozen bears by the time I was 12.
Well, you're going to need every bit of good aim you've got, Davy, if you're going to win this shooting match here today.
Well, bullseyes ain't bears, Quaker John. But they ain't moving none either. Why, they're easier to hit than a 30-pound standing chicken.
This was the biggest shooting match ever held in the state of Tennessee. But Davy wasn't in it just for the fun and dancing. He was out to win the prime beef live steer that came as first prize. Because if he won the steer, he'd have enough property to get married. And Polly Finley, a neighbor's daughter, was the girl of his heart.
All right. You Cracker Jacks, hear me out. We start at 50 yards from the target. Each man just gets one shot. Then that gets bullseyes shoots at 75 yards. Then the 3 top marksmen shoot at 100. Get me? Load up!
The first time around, there were nearly 50 men tied for the first 3 places. Davy gave a long whistle, realizing how good all these other pioneers were. But the Durham steer was worth the concentration, so he loaded his flintlock and took careful aim at 75 yards.
Just fire when you're ready, gentlemen.
This time, there were only 3 men left. An old veteran scout named Clark, a hunter called Johnson, and Davy. At 100 yards, they took their turns, and the crowd fell silent.
Clark! Bullseye! Johnson! Bullseye! Crockett! Bullseye! All right. Gentlemen, now you move them targets back another 10 yards, and then we tries again. Mr. Clark? On the small circle, Mr. Clark, but off the bullseye. Oh. Mr. Johnson? Nicked the bullseye, but not dead on. Mr. Crockett.
Davy looked over at the big steer chewing on the grass. Then up at the target.
Why, if that old bullseye was a bear running upside down on a tree branch floating up a river, I could knock a fly off his nose. I could do it riding backwards on a Tennessee mule. Just hold tight, Polly Finley. You're about to get a husband.
Jack Diamond, you a bold. You robbed my poor pockets of silver and gold. It's whiskey, you villain.
So Davy won his steer, sold it for a $5 gold piece, which was a considerable amount of money back then, and married his Polly. Mrs. Finley gave her daughter the family spinning wheel. Quaker John staked them to supplies at his store, and before long, they had a child of their own. But Davy had the frontier blood running in his veins, and he wasn't made to sit still.
Now, Polly, this here land we keep hearing talk about in South Tennessee, it's just there for the taking.
But we got a baby boy to think of, and the horses. And how'd we live in wild country like that?
Well, I'll build us a big old timber raft and set you and the baby and the horses and the spinning wheel right up on top. And I'll tie a rope to it with the other end round my waist, sit down on the back of some fat alligator, and get us towed the whole way down.
You're impossible, Davy. But if you've got a mind for something, I guess we better do it, or there won't be no peace.
So they got passage on a 60-foot flatboat, full up with families of children, crates of squawking chickens, trappers with bundles of coonskins, scouts in buckskin shirts like Davy's, and they all moved down the Holston River. When they got to the country that's now called Lincoln County, Tennessee, the Crockett's went ashore. And started west.
Now, Polly, you and the baby ride up on the old horse, with the colts behind. I'll walk on ahead with the dog.
Oh, Davy, it's beautiful. Just smell the sweetness in the wind.
There's more bars and bees and turkeys and coons and partridge than anywhere else. And they all just waiting for us to come along.
Once I had a collie pup, dug a hole and covered him up. I sat there for most an hour, waiting for a cauliflower. Round and round, oh Joe Clark, round and round I say. Round and round, oh Joe Clark, goodbye Billy Brown. Round and round, oh Joe Clark, round and round I say. Round and round, oh Joe Clark, goodbye Billy Brown.
So the Crockett's made a new home, right in the middle of where no one had ever set foot before. In a clearing by the Mulberry Fork of Elk River, Davy built a small cabin with his own hands. They planted greens and corn and gourds and potatoes. Davy hunted whenever he got free of working the land, and they were full up with bear meat, possum, venison, wild honey, and every kind of berry and fruit the fields had to offer. But it was also the land of the Creek Indians, who didn't take very well to having their country walked over by strangers in coonskin caps. Every so often, news of a small raid reached the Crockett cabin and gave Davy something to think about. Then one day, a group of men rode up while Davy was out chopping a tree. And he knew there was trouble when he saw their worried faces.
Hey there! You the Davy Crockett we heard tell about?
Depends on what you heard.
The Creeks just massacred a whole settlement of women and children, Mr. Crockett, down in Fort Mims. We heard you killed 100 bears since you got to Tennessee, and we thought you might want to have a try at the Injuns.
Fort Mims? Why, that's a peaceable settlement.
Hey, it was. Ain't even a piece
Polly
of wood
had come
left
out into
now.
the yard to see what all the commotion was, and she stood there while the men talked. She knew that if Davy was needed, he'd have to go. So when he looked in her direction, she smiled bravely and nodded her head.
Well, looks like you got another man, gentlemen. I ain't never been to one of these war things, but I heard talk about 'em. One thing, though, it was 105 bars, all of 'em as big as the horses you're a-setting on. Well, don't just stare like a bunch of horned owls. Come in and have some food while I get myself ready.
So Davy went off under the command of Major William Russell. He worked for the Army as a scout, not as a regular soldier, always moving ahead of the small band of volunteers, watching the forest floor for signs of Indians, keeping an ear to the wind for sounds that would give the Creeks away. One day, in the territory that would later become the state of Alabama, while moving towards the camp of General Andrew Jackson, Davy was half a mile in front of his men when he heard a familiar sound.
Now, that's funny. Wouldn't be no chicken that I know of wandering around the woods. But it sure must be something. Easy now. This might be a rooster wearing war paint.
Davy dropped to the ground just as the arrow cleaved the air next to his head. But he yelled anyway to make the Indian think he'd been hit. Then he lay as still as the tree behind him and waited. But at first, nothing happened. Quite suddenly, From an opening across the clearing, there appeared a face streaked with red and yellow markings.
Okay, Mr. Rooster, let's see what kind of feathers you got. Looks like a creek, all right. And if there's one of them, there's bound to be more.